call this meeting to order. This is the Special Board of Education meeting. We'll be in open session today, and this is a workshop. We're here to look at the behavior education plan, the evaluation, and again with our special guest who's here, I think for the second time, maybe third, but I know at least twice. And so looking forward to the discussion and the conversation. Thanks for the behavior education plan evaluation form, and a lot of good information in here. I'm sure that the board will have a lot of questions, and we're looking forward to a very hearty discussion this evening. So Jen, I'll let you start off and get us going here.
Thanks, James. Good to see everybody. Yeah, this is like a real workshop. So we're going to have a different kind of interaction than we normally do. It's a chance for all of us to process together where we've been, where we're going next. I know you all know that we have been on this mission and part of a national movement to disrupt what's called the pipeline to prison. That is where this particular effort was born. Over 3 years ago now, we committed to making sure that every one of our schools provides a safe and supportive environment for students, and that we were reducing exclusionary practice, which pushes students outside of the circle of care and concern. And our goal is to keep students inside of the circle of care and concern because we think that's where they belong. We have never, as a district, felt like our efforts to create safe and supportive schools are in conflict with our desire to reduce exclusionary practice. We think those things go hand in hand. We adopted the behavior plan several years ago. Since then, we've been providing the board with these quarterly updates, information on both implementation and outcomes. We did that because over 3 years ago when we originally set out to do this and Dr. Osher joined us in thinking about what was up ahead, we knew going in that it was going to be complex work and that we had to stay disciplined and keep tabs on it and continually learn from what was happening. So that's what we've been up to. We knew that there were not going to be easy answers, and there weren't any templates to follow, unfortunately. So today's meeting is focused on taking stock of our progress over the last 3 years. We completed the 3-year evaluation. Really, kudos to Andrew and his team. I think it's a very helpful document. And our team has been processing it internally since we received it not too long ago. We have been using that information coupled with obviously our own knowledge and experience over the last several years to zero in on what we think are the most powerful focus areas for the upcoming years, and focus areas that we hope will have the impact that we desire. I do want to say that I've got to just be very clear that I'm incredibly proud of the team that has taken this on, and by team, I actually mean the larger district-wide leadership team, including all of the people who are sitting in this room today, who have more formal leadership roles. And I'm really excited about culling everything that we've learned so we can be more effective in the coming years. You know from seeing the evaluation, we're not going to go through all those findings. We're assuming everybody read it. It's a good resource, and you've seen in that evaluation that we have done some things fairly well. Our documentation processes have gotten better. The mobile response teams have been strength. We've seen a reduction in exclusionary practice at the elementary level. So there's certainly some things that we're very happy about and wanting to see more of. And we know that we haven't made the desired impact that we want, particularly at the secondary level. We haven't seen the desired impact on reduction of exclusionary practice. We haven't seen the desired impact on disproportionality. That does not mean that we're giving up. Like I said, we are proud of the policy that we created with the board. We are we don't regret leading with it. I think that's really important. That was a decision we made to lead with the policy change. We don't regret that. It started a conversation that needed to happen in our community. But we do recognize, yet again, that this is complex change, not just complicated change. It does require a restorative mindset, which is it's a major shift for all of us. It requires a deep and lasting commitment to interrupt racial bias. I mean, this is lifelong work that you never end. And it ultimately takes actively building much stronger, authentic relationships with students, particularly students of color, because that's the only way we're going to pave the way for deeper learning experiences in the classroom. And all that is actually not just about the behavior plan. That is about teaching and learning. It's much bigger than that. We just had the first day of our institute to kick off the school year today, and the whole focus of this year is on culturally responsive teaching. So we understand that that has to be our focus for many reasons. So I just wanted to say those few things. We're going to ask for your feedback on the lessons learned that we've outlined in our next steps. It's essentially our draft theory of action. If we focus on this set of focus areas, will we attain the outcomes that we desire? We're testing this theory of action with you. So we want you to be thinking about that. If we focus on these areas, will we get the change that we seek? David is here again. So happy to have you here, David. As you know, he works on the issue of disproportionality in discipline, school discipline nationally. We're very lucky to have him back again 3 years later to give us some insight on what he sees nationally and what he's seeing locally. I do want to remind the board, when we left off on the behavior topic in May, we were looking at our annual policy changes. We made some immediate policy changes. During that conversation, there was talk among the board. I mean, some of these lessons aren't new to us. We've been learning them along the way. In fact, most of them we've been learning along the way. And there was a big discussion about wanting to change some of the kind of tone and language of the behavior plan, like the front matter, to state our commitment to proactively supporting students, et cetera. We decided not to scramble and try to make that deep level change in 2 weeks. We thought it was important for us to have this conversation first and then work on rewriting that front matter for next spring's board approval of the policy. So just wanted to remind you of where we left off. And I think that's pretty much it. We're going to dive into our agenda. I'm going to pass it off in just a second here to David, who's going to talk to us for about 15 or so minutes on what is happening nationally, just to get us some perspective. Then we're going to dive into the lessons learned. And what we thought we would do, James, is go through them one by one and open up conversation for each lesson. Thinking that it might take about an hour to get through them all, rather than wait until the very end to open up discussion. So hopefully that will work. And then there'll be time at the end to have a more free and open discussion about whatever else we might want to talk about that we haven't already addressed. Sound good? And I do want to point out, I asked Alex, Andrew, Leah, Nancy, John to join us as part of the conversation because they touch the work so intimately. Alex and Nancy from a leadership perspective. Andrew's team obviously wrote the evaluation. John from a special ed perspective, and obviously Leah leads our behavior team. So thank you for letting them join the conversation too. All right, David.
Okay, so am I on? Okay, I'm going to set this for 15 minutes. I don't think I want to take any more than that. Okay, so that we can open up, and I do not mind you asking questions while I'm going if you want as well. Let me start with the biggest pick. Well, actually, let me start with the bottom line. When I met with Jen a few minutes ago, she said to me, "David, is there anything you saw in the report that really surprised you based on what you know nationally?" And the answer is no. So let me be very, very clear. And let me try to tell you why a little. And also not remind you, because I think this is a board that is deeply committed, but to reinforce your commitment to really doing this work, both because of issues of justice and equity, but also because of issues of education and building a different Madison. Okay. You know, we live, in the first time I was in Madison, I was a historical sociologist, and I came here because I was studying race during the Civil War. And I start there because of the fact that the Civil War occurred already in a society that was deeply affected and impacted by race. And while Wisconsin was on the right side, like if you look at abolitionism in the North, even though it was on the right side, it was still what we would call today pretty prejudiced. And particularly in its presumptions regarding what is the ability of people of color to end up doing the type of work that we want. And it's not easy to get rid of that. That is institutionalized within the fabric of a society that we live in. With all of its justice, we also have that injustice. And just as, you know, William E.B. Du Bois talked about at the turn of the 20th century about the dual consciousness that people of color have to have, loving a country that does not love them, I think we all, if we're committed to issues of justice, have to also be aware of that dual consciousness, which is we can love our country and aspire for what it is, and also understand the fact that there are pieces that are really, really tough to change. They are, in the end, ultimately changeable, but it's not easy. You know, I work in South Africa, and I talk to my colleagues there in post-apartheid South Africa. I say, we don't have it over you. We're still struggling with those issues that you're struggling with. But it doesn't mean that it can't go away. It can go away. So I want to really start with that. And also start with one other basic proposition, that among the reasons why, as educators, that you really want to deal with exclusionary discipline is because it also undermines the ability of kids to learn. What you want is kids motivated to learn, kids who want to create an academic community where they and others can learn because of the fact that they really want to learn for themselves, but they want to learn collectively, and they want to learn to make this a better place. And that is aspirable. That is realizable, but it's not easy. And so even if I were to put away and aside the issue of justice, just the issue of academic excellence is not going to be gotten to if you are just pushing kids into school. That's not sufficient. And in part, what we know about the dynamics of situations is that particularly for kids who are harder to engage, maybe because they are harder, or maybe because they're different from you, unless you have a need to engage them, you're likely to push them out in some way. And so the image I have, and if I used it last time, and I'm going to use some space shot images, is Apollo 13, because probably almost everyone's seen it. And it's that moment in Apollo 13 where the person comes into the room and dumps the stuff and says, this is all we have to get them out. Do it. And for those of us who work in strength-based work, we know that's about then finding a strength. Because as long as I can remove somebody or ignore somebody, I don't have to find their strengths. But if I can't, then I do. So that this stuff is inextricably linked, and let me just make sure I know where we are. That's fine. Okay. All right. I want to drop down one big level for a second, and I want to, for the next 2 or 3 minutes, share with you lessons I've learned since I saw you last time. Not about this particularly, but other things that are probably more important. With others, over the past 9 months, funded by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, I had the opportunity to try to synthesize what we're learning across multiple sciences of learning and development regarding how kids learn and how kids develop. And I want to just pass on to you the underlying messages that will be out in a special issue in 2 months, and then there'll be more practice-oriented things. Genetics are not the future for kids. What we call epigenetics are, but the process to epigenesis takes place within the social context in which people grow and develop. And the key element in those social contexts is the ability of adults to attune to kids. Now, there are bigger pieces because adults face stresses as well, whether it's a parent or a teacher. And if they're not supported in handling their stresses, it's harder for them to attune. And kids also listen and respond to other kids. And so if other kids don't have the right social and emotional skills, it's harder for kids to learn. But in the end, genetics are not destiny. And that goes back to issues of racism in our society and that fundamental notion that some people are different. What is destiny is the ability to create supportive environments. And even if kids have experienced bad things, we can create environments that help address that. And what we now know is that the brain can be rewired and reconnected and different things. So I start there. Okay, I gotta watch this with my finger. I can't be as gesticulating these days, you know? Okay, anyway. Second lesson's very, very different. Over the past few years with funding from the U.S. Office of Health and Human Services, we've done a lot of work on trying to understand more about implementation and about the readiness to do things. And I just want to pass on to you the two big message lines. One is that evidence is necessary but not sufficient because it's about implementation. I would also say policy is necessary but not sufficient because it's about implementation. And then let me move to the second piece, which is about what we're learning about implementation and readiness to implement. I'm going to give you a heuristic that we use that you'll remember because you know it already. I'll just give you different definitions. R equals MC squared. R is readiness. M is the motivation, and it's the motivation of all the key players. And then you have two C's. One is the general capacity of an organization. It could be the capacity of the district. If you go to a school, it can be the capacity of a school to do its work. But the other C is the capacity to do the particular work that is involved in what you're doing here. And the reason that that heuristic is important, it's mathematical. If any number is low, everything is low. Okay, and in the case of the work that you were trying to do and what's happening across the country, what you have is that the M is not very, very high. And even for people who really believe this is right, the M isn't that high because of the fact that there are other things that they feel they have to do as well, so it's not a priority. And in addition, part of motivation is going to connect to capacity, because if I don't feel that I can do something, I'm less motivated to do it. And so if you're asking me to respond to kids in a very, very different way, and I really don't know how to, I'm less motivated to do it because I don't know, and I'm going to feel uncomfortable changing and taking even more risks, and maybe I'll be even more unable to do the job than things like that than I otherwise would. So R equals MC squared, and I think in lots of places each one of those numbers can be low, but we can also change them. And the work we do with readiness, and we're now being funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and working with the Centers for Disease Control to not just assess readiness, but to help people build readiness. And so it's that readiness is not our assessments is not a snapshot. You come in and you say you're unready. Because this society, our country, is not ready to handle race yet. But that doesn't mean we go away. So I want to go back to the moon for a second. And the way we got to the moon the first time was not by just a series of successes. If you go back to the movie The Right Stuff and everything, and some of us are old enough to remember all the rockets that fell. But if you really want to be committed, you have to look at failure and then turn it around into success. Many of you may know the work of Jonathan Kozol. Okay. One book you may not know is a book he wrote called Children of the Revolution, which is about the literacy campaign in Cuba. And if you know about it, in spite of all the other challenges in Cuba, it almost has an entirely literate population. And his description there makes the analogy to, if I remember correctly, to going to the moon, because of the fact that when the Cubans started, they didn't have successes. But the goal was, no matter what, we'll do it. Let's then figure out what else we have to do. Let's learn from what's not working until we get to the point we realize that excellence. And that's what has to, I think, happen here and across the country. Okay, so let me just look once more. Okay, all right. So, in many places, people are trying to do this work. There have been improvements in codes of conduct. There has been enforcement of, of efforts that have led to a reduction of exclusionary discipline. It's been more for white kids than black kids, and so we continue to have disciplinary disparities. And just as in Madison, it's easier to do with elementary school kids than it is later on. And that's for a lot of reasons, including the fact that elementary school teachers, even though they're not well educated in child development, don't ignore the fact that education is about child development. Oftentimes, even the best high school teachers see themselves as teaching subjects, not teaching kids. 2 years ago, for a national summit run by the Department of Education, they asked me to join Dr. James Comer to give a presentation on cultural competence. And when I called up Dr. Comer, he said, "David, I don't want to talk about cultural competence. I want to talk about child development. Because if people really understand child development, they'll interact with kids differently." Now, we did give the workshop on cultural competence, but I say that because it's easier for elementary school teachers, not easy, to start acting in a culturally responsive manner. And I didn't know from the plan until I heard Jen talk about your focus on cultural responsiveness. So just let me say, as I'm ending this beginning, that in the work we're doing on the science of learning and development, one of the many things we pull out but keep on coming back to is the importance of cultural responsiveness. For decades I talked about cultural competence, but I've now recognized the fact that cultural competence may be necessary, but like evidence, it's not sufficient. Because if I as a student or I as a parent don't experience you as interacting with me in a culturally responsive way, I'm not going to feel as connected, as supported, as safe. And therefore, I'm not going to take the types of academic risks that are very, very necessary. And at the same time, if I as a teacher think about all I have to do is become culturally proficient and don't learn that I have to really start understanding life in terms of all the different factors that lead people to be making the adaptations they have, and also all the richness that can be possibly potentially leveraged in every child's background so he can succeed, I'm not going to be as effective. So what I would say in ending here is that all over the country, places are in a situation where they have to adapt more. In fact, in my last, maybe it's 1 minute over, but I'll end by saying, I so believe in what you are talking about, that there's a tool that AIR has that, as Jen knows, when I talked to her about it before, and it turns out she's used it, it was not an AIR product, because I don't like pushing AIR products, but I believe so much in the fact that it's about how people change that I've actually gone to my colleagues at AIR, now that we have this tool, it's called the concerns-based adoption model, and said, we need to adapt that model to this really gnarly, really tough, but very, very necessary issue to deal with. And what I like about CBAM, and what I think you're encountering here, is the fact that it's both about changing people's affect, their attitudes, their beliefs, their desire to do things, the M, but it's also changing the C. And neither of those are easy, and if you're going to really get there, you have to be able to be attentive to the steps that people are taking as they're going, and you have to be listening to them, because it's not just a journey that a board can take. It's not just a journey when I'm on a task force in New York City on climate and discipline that we can take. It's a journey you have to take with the staff and with the students. But it's a worthwhile journey. In fact, it's the right journey. And I turn it on to you, and I can turn it off. It just started telling me to stop.
Thank you.
Great.
Should I close that?
I would suggest that we get right into the lessons. Is that okay? All right, let's do it. And we'll start to open up the conversation for everyone who's around the table. Leah's going to take the lead to say a couple of words, and then we'll pause on each one. So,
Great.
Leah, take it away.
All right, thank you, and thank you, Dr. Osher. I truly appreciate and I'm just so thankful you were here this evening, and appreciative of the time you've spent with us since third quarter in May, or the end of third quarter in March, sorry. All right, so at this time I'm going to transition us to our overview of behavior education initiatives across the country to our own local experiences in implementing the behavior education plan here in Madison. So this, these two outcomes will look familiar to you. Implementing the behavior education plan requires both attention to both policy and practice. And simply applying the policy won't produce, as David talked about, the outcomes we seek to achieve. Rather, both must be simultaneously held and tended as we seek to achieve our ultimate goal of decreasing disproportionality for students with disabilities and our African American students. So in the slides to come, and I'll go into the first lesson learned here in just a second, and then we'll pause after each one. We will outline lessons learned from the last 3 years and key implementation steps. And then I also want to just note that moving forward, we will be working to collect and analyze implementation data in a different way so that we can both assess whether what we are doing is producing the outcomes that we seek to achieve, and wanting to have some quantitative and qualitative evidence to point in that direction. TJ, yeah.
Yeah, I just, on this first slide, I think how we frame what the goals were is very, very important.
Yeah.
And, you know, and dozens of people worked on this plan, and 7 people passed it, so, you know, everyone has their own goals in some sense. But I do think the first goal is, kind of leads us in a bad direction, and I would rephrase that as decrease or replace exclusionary practices with supportive and educational practices. Decreasing exclusionary practices is very, very simple. And if we define our goal as that, that's fine. You know, you can do that with a policy document. But replacing with education and supportive is very, very difficult. And that's, you know, in some ways we've done very well. Actually, we haven't done quite so well.
I was gonna say.
We did well initially, but then I think that the fact we haven't done the second very well has misled us. So, you know, just at the very start when we frame what were our goals, and then I'll just add that I know personally, and I know that I was absolutely in a minority of the people involved, that I saw the decrease in disproportionality as a very much a secondary or even a tertiary goal, and something that would not be achieved till students were provided repeatedly with the supports and education, and that was very much a long-term goal. That, you know, we weren't going to change that one overnight, but if over time we provide the proper supports and education and proper environments, then eventually disproportionality is going to change. And disproportionality, I think that the evaluation, and I'll be quiet after this one last sentence, the evaluation is very good in pointing to the disproportionality is a product both of both players in it, of both, you know, and that balance between staff action and student action is both contribute to disproportionality. And so, and I think that both need, the changes have to happen with both, but that's a much longer term thing. So that's it. But just framing to begin with.
I'm glad that you paused on this. I was hoping we would actually pause on the goals because I know in talking with David and with our team, we also were pressure testing whether or not these were the right goals. Like, have we learned something about this? Should they be changed? And David, do you want to comment on them, actually?
Sure. Happy to. And, I personally think that the reframing is correct. Where I would say is that while ultimately you will not be able to end exclusionary discipline disparities without doing it, I think the reason why you want to front end as much as possible is only because of the fact that we know that overall, our data is only group data. The fact that a kid experiences suspension in itself is a risk factor for all sorts of things. We know that the pipeline to prison, but it's grade retention, it's dropout, it's less a lesser likelihood of going on to post-secondary education success. And so I want to go back again. I think the overarching framing is a better one in a lot of ways from my perspective. I would still try, no matter what, to create conditions in the district where we understand, or where everyone who's doing it understands that suspension is a dangerous intervention. There may be rare cases where you want to do it, but no matter what, it's something that has risks for kids. And let me just add one thing that I should have added before that if I had more time I would have. We know a lot more about trauma-sensitive approaches right now and trauma-informed approaches than we did a few years ago as well. And if you think about those kids who are most needy, white or black or Latino or red in the community, or Asian, those who've experienced adverse childhood experiences, be it violence or witnessing violence or loss of a parent, are ones who are more likely to exhibit the positive adaptations that people make to bad situations. But those positive adaptations in this case of being hypervigilant,
right,
and not trusting people, which
Protective.
often are seen as being behavioral problems.
Yeah.
And when you take someone who really doesn't trust people and you just kick them out of the community for a day, what you're doing is reinforcing those things. And so, again, I want to go back that it is about support. It is about creating a different environment. That should be up and center, and I would put a lot of TA on it, and at the same time, still find other ways until you get there of not just pushing kids out.
Any other thoughts on the goals before we get into lessons learned?
All right. So the next several slides, as we shared, outline our key lessons learned. On the left are the lessons, and on the right are the corresponding implementation areas. Also on the right is just a description of how this implementation focus will be made visible in our schools. What you are seeing is a list of the highest leverage next steps, but not necessarily an exhaustive list of each step that is a part of implementing the behavior education plan. Our first lesson is related to mindset and the development of a school community and the critical importance of collaborative leadership and collective understanding and developing the disposition necessary to implement the behavior education plan. So we actually believe we underestimated. We believe we underestimated what it takes to shift adult beliefs and values, shaping or reshaping mindset to be one that is more progressive and restorative in nature. Engaging in that mindset work we know is imperative to cultivate equitable and inclusive school communities where all students feel they belong. In particular, we want our students of color to truly feel like they belong in our schools. Throughout my presentation, I will be pointing to some school examples that are exemplary and that we can learn from. And so Principal Jamie Sims at Blackhawk Middle School is a great example of a restorative leader, someone who works to develop this culture in his community. Mr. Sims has repeatedly demonstrated restorative leadership and is featured in one of our case studies that also has a video, so I encourage you to check it out. Over the next 3 years then, recognizing that underestimate of time and reflection time in particular around our beliefs and values, we want to continue to deepen our implementation, focusing on those skills and dispositions that are really critical to cultivate restorative and equitable school communities. And we believe that in doing so, we'll begin to see increases in the practices that promote equity and decreases in the disproportionate use of exclusionary discipline. So we truly believe that the shifting of mindsets and dispositions around behavior education, particularly behavior education for students of color, will be critical in impacting disproportionate outcomes. Yeah.
Thoughts on that one from any board member or from the team?
I just have a process question, maybe. I found the recommendations from the report and this overlapping but not the same, and so I just wanted to ask, is the primary discussion going to be around these and not the other? Okay.
Yep. What we're thinking is the evaluation recommendations are a good background for you to have, but we wanted you to know what our team believes we need to do next.
These are where your guys are focused.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was my question, so thank you.
Yeah. So any thoughts on this idea of really pushing hard on restorative mindset and beliefs and values, especially led by a shared leadership team at the school level? Nikki?
I was reading with this, I was reading on the other document, and we say we're a PBIS school, correct?
Yep.
Can we still be a PBIS school if we allow seclusion and restraint in some of our programs with like the alternative schools? Isn't that counterintuitive of what PBIS is? If we're using an intervention strategy method, why are we using seclusion and restraint?
That's an excellent question.
I'll just begin. I'll speak just to the PBIS piece. That the PBIS is a framework. It's an important framework that helps us lay out what needs to be in place for solid behavior systems in school. So we know that having a solid school-wide system around behavior response is critical for the implementation of the plan. And so PBIS helps us to think through and be thoughtful about how we develop that framework and that infrastructure in our building. And they provide us with measures to determine whether or not we're at fidelity and to help us to action plan. In doing so, we think that that implementing a framework such as PBIS will help impact the need for exclusionary discipline like suspension or expulsion by decreasing behavior incidents. And we also think that through that framework, we will better meet our students' needs, our students with disabilities, to mitigate for the need for seclusion and restraint. So it's about building that foundation, and I'll let John speak specifically then to the seclusion restraint.
Yeah, I mean, the technical definition is like, because we use restraint and seclusion practices doesn't exclude us from being considered a district that implements PBIS. I don't know if you're concerned about like the technical definitions. If this is more on the philosophical end, you know, I think there's many ways to approach this. And you may appreciate this. I mean, we're a district that has nearly 4,000 students with disabilities. We send 0 of our students to more restrictive settings. All of our students are in this district. We own all of them. And yes, they may be in lesser restrictive environments, to more restrictive, given, you know, alternative programs, alternative learning programs. But we look at the intermittent and very minimal use of restraint seclusion as keeping kids in their least restrictive environment to the degree possible. And I say that from the bottom of my heart, that this is a much more instructive and more positive practice versus simply suspending a student, versus sending a student to a different district out of placement, versus sending them to a highly, highly restrictive placement. So we know from our own data that students who are subject to restraint and seclusion do not spend vast periods of time. They learn from this. You can see from elementary, middle to high school that the curve is dramatically steep going down, and it's a practice that students are learning from.
Yeah, go ahead, Anna. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't, go ahead, James, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you bring that up, because that is a question when you look at exclusionary practices.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm always interested in the fact that we don't include seclusion and restraint within that data. And I understand why we don't, because we're not obligated to do that. But I do think it's something that we should be looking closely at and monitoring just as closely as suspension and expulsions, because when we see the decline through middle and high school for seclusion and restraint, that's when we see the uptick in suspensions.
Yeah.
So it's not, I'm not sure kids are really learning. I think we're using just a different exclusionary practice. So I would kind of put them into the same pot. And I think going back to your comments as well, we know the impact of seclusion and restraint is extremely traumatizing for children in particular, and it's used, again, usually on kids that already have a trauma history, because those are coping skills that we see as bad behavior. So I still am interested in seeing that data be included and being looking at that more closely. My other comment just around the attitudes, changing attitudes, it is very difficult. I see that a lot in my work, but one thing I would say that as a district we have to be mindful of is that we need to have the support structures in place, not only for our students, but also for our teachers. And so we need to be critical and look at what systems we have in place at a district level that reinforce the attitudes that people bring into classrooms. And I think that's a place that leadership needs to look at closely and make sure that we're not only giving professional development, but we're changing those structures that reinforce those attitudes.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think under this kind of umbrella of restorative culture, it makes a ton of sense to bring up the question and concern about restraint and seclusion. I think we would reduce even further the use of it, and I'm sure John agrees with that, if everyone was bringing a restorative mindset to their decision making. And I see Steph first.
Just hold on, a point of order is right here.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, James.
Before we move to Dean, I want to stay with Anna a minute, because I want to elaborate, because I want to be clear on the point made about how we are reinforcing certain attitudes. Could you elaborate on that, or could someone else explain that? Because I'm not clear as to what we're doing in our buildings, our schoolhouses. It might be reinforcing. Reinforces some of the attitudes that we have. I'm not clear on that point.
Sure.
But I understand the point. But
did you want me to elaborate, like an example?
You or whomever.
Well, I think of an example of like when we look at some of our students that may bring greater challenges to teaching and whatever. There are things in place that we tend to place large groups of kids that have similar challenges in the same classroom. Many times those classrooms are the hardest to staff because of the challenges, and then that means we have a late hire, we have someone uncertified teaching in there, and so then you're kind of setting up that whole space for failure. And when you experience failure, just as kids do, then it's difficult to have the attitude that this can be successful. Right. So I guess that's the example I can think of.
It's a good example.
Appreciate that. Before anyone elaborate, Dean?
Yeah, I'm interested in the 3 bullets that are here, because as David was saying, by the way, welcome back. And nice to see you again, man. And as he mentioned a little bit earlier, within the last 2 years, we've learned a lot more about how to deal and implement trauma-informed teaching, as well as trauma-informed care at different levels of staff. Teaching it and being able to, there's a lingo and terms that come with trauma-informed education practices as well as treatment. And restorative language is involved, and in that, not just the terminology, but it's the tone of your voice. How loud are you talking? And you should be talking. And along with the motivational interviewing and hearing all these things, how much time are we spending teaching teachers how to do that?
Right.
All three of those bullets. Are we putting enough time into that?
I think we're saying we need to put more into it. That was our lesson.
Because
and that
it
we
is,
need to put more.
because if we're talking about transformation, transforming people's attitudes, we can change the structure all we want. Will the structure change people's attitudes? I don't know. Yeah, you'd hope so, but not necessarily. Attitudes have to be really built, and people have to practice it, and until it gets internalized, and unless we really, and it comes out in the way you automatically respond with the language to a specific event in your classroom. Those bullets to me are really key to what we're trying to get at. So we spend enough time on that.
Dave, do you want to comment? I'm sorry, James. I'm
Why
not
don't I
sure
just wait?
how to-
I don't remember names
TJ.
because I.
TJ.
Okay. If TJ comes in, then I do have some comments, and actually on Anna's as well as Dean's.
Okay, let's do that.
And I'd like to take this, let's keep this very straight, and it's kind of building on, but also going in a slightly different direction, which is that I think that, no one at this table and no one in our district would question the need that attitudes are part of the problem and staff attitudes are part of the problem. But from talking with staff, and I actually read through the entire 75 pages of BEP survey comments this weekend. Yeah, torture. And one of the things that came up over and over again wasn't that the attitudes that people didn't want to participate in this, but around the communication, the opportunities to do restorative work, the difficulties of the time. Where is the time to do this? And if the restorative work is being done in the hallway with mobile response team people, then the teacher is not involved in that, and that's a constant frustration that you saw at all levels, elementary, middle, and high school. When you get to the high school level, and particularly the structures, and you talked about the different structures, and I think the structures that there is the attitude towards I teach history, I teach algebra, I teach this, but there's also the structure of 50-minute classes 5 days a week, and building relationships and doing restorative work within that structure is very, very difficult. And so I guess that as we look at, you can do things like what tone of voice do you have, and we can spread those practices around. But doing actual restorative work, and even to some extent building relationships within these structures, is very, very difficult for our teachers who want to do the work. Not and not to say that there are some who don't want to do the work, but those who do want to do the work, express continual frustration around the structures. And I don't know, I don't think any of us have answers to that, but I think that until we look at it from that lens, and the lens of opportunities and time, as well as beliefs and attitudes, we're not going to get too much further than we are now. So,
Could I add one
Sure, please.
more
In fact,
thing
what-
to the
anyone in
same,
that-
it's on the
what?
same
Right.
exact point, but I don't think we've referred to the data that is in the research report, which basically says less than half of our staff will say that my beliefs and values align with the approach to the behavior outlined in the BEP. That hasn't changed over the last 3 years. So with all these resources and all of this training and all that work, we have to, certainly there's half who replied yes, and maybe there's other impediments. But when you have, this isn't even unconscious bias, I would say this is a recognized almost bias. That to me is very concerning. And those are the people who admit it.
Does anybody else want to add anything before I do a little response?
I think we've gone around.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I think so.
All right, and that's Mary?
Mary, yeah.
Mary, okay. I think you all have really hit on pieces of the issue that really connect, okay? And I'll go back from Mary. I'm unpack in reverse though, okay? That, you know, that people can believe in many things, but some may be more important. And to them, I don't mean that they are. And I think that just trying to persuade people in the value of what everyone here may believe in itself is not going to change things when there are other things going on in their work situation, but also their life situation. I mean, we go home, we listen to the media. People talk to their colleagues and things like that. And whether or not you're in New York City, where I work, which is a pretty blue state, or though Madison probably does not reflect Wisconsin, but you're in Wisconsin, there are all sorts of attitudes that pull people back in other ways. And I think I was not surprised by that number. I think it's an honest number. And at the same time, both the issues that Dean and TJ were raising in terms of more time to help people process and to implement is really important. This is not just a cognitive process. It's very, very much an emotional process. And it also means people working through in their own lives, in their networks, real changes, which are not very, very easy because oftentimes other things reinforce the opposite. And if I were to suggest a mistake that is being made across the country, and I'd say across the world, because I actually spend 1/3 of my time doing other stuff. And remember, it's not just about, this is a piece of what I do. I don't just work in a discipline space. It's not paying enough time to help people get good at what they do. To help people work through what they need to do so that they can be committed to get good. And while there are few of us who are sort of initial adopters and then dig in and handle all the frustrations and hit their hands all the time and break things, most people only commit when they have enough time to do it, when they have enough process to do it, when their peers around them are doing it and things like that. And that takes time, and it may be that when you think about how you spend resources, and resources are finite, I would think about putting more resources into those sort of issues because it's really important. It even includes the issue of helping people develop alternatives to restraint and seclusion. And yes, you read me correctly. I mean, obvious, I think that even if it's well intended, and I think there are reasons why you may, and it may be better, it may not be experienced as being better. If anything, it may still have the same consequences. But for people to be able to react in a different way so that they don't still set up the stage for the behavior that leads to restraint. And that's part of the connection to PBIS, is more and more that you won't avoid it. And then let me add to Anna's point, and I think you used the best example. I mean, there are other examples, but we know from consistent research that when you take young people who have challenges and put them in secluded places or segregated places with other young people who have challenges, you have more challenges. And it's in part because the young people reinforce each other, but it's in part because of the fact that it's harder for teachers to do, and I'm going to use that word that we're using in the science of learning development, attune. I don't just mean a connect, but I mean attune in the way in which we want parents to be able to attune, in which we're all biologically actually ready for it at the right moment. But we want, situations where when a teacher is interacting with a kid who is troubling, you don't have cortisol, the stress hormone, coming in, but you have love hormones coming out. You really want bonding going on. But that's not easy, and it's not easy on a 1-on-1. It's really not easy in a 10-on-1 or a 15-on-1. And so there are structural factors that contribute, even though better to keep them in the district than to keep them out. But there are structural factors that contribute. And again, I think time and processing and creating a zone where people can comfortably talk about their discomfort, not so that it will be accepted, but one can sort of work through what I think are ultimately win-win situations, but they're ones that acknowledge the reality that people face, where they're saying, I know you want me to do something else, but how do I do it? I'm not equipped to do it.
Yeah. I want to move us on to the next lesson, but I will say that our team thinks this is one of the most important lessons, and what everyone is saying is right. We often talk about when you can have an intention to want to do the right thing, right? To learn and embrace a restorative mindset and restorative practice. But we have many competing commitments in our lives that push against one another and keep us stuck. And, right? And so what I'm hearing is, how do we kind of clean out some of the competing commitments so that we can allow people the time and space to make the commitment that many do want to make. And I think that is true.
Yeah. Can I just add one last thing? Is that
Yeah.
part of the challenge for adults as well as kids is unlearning. And it's unlearning what is conscious, but it's also unlearning what is unconscious. And
Right.
that again takes time.
Right.
Okay, it's not something that can happen in a one-day workshop, but it can happen.
So, Jen, I have a question around that, because
Yeah.
you have what the next steps are and what the focus is going to be and
Yeah.
the bullet points. We have 50 schools and 4,000 staff.
Yeah.
Is this something that we are intending to do more on a pilot basis, where we actually prove the concept of understanding, yes, it's time, or it's this, or it's that? Because my concern is we go another 3 years.
Right.
We basically see no more change,
That's what we're worried
because
about,
we've spread
too.
all our resources and our time too thin, rather than basically is validating the concept on a smaller basis, seeing that it works before
Yeah.
we go
That's an
further.
excellent question.
And I
Well,
would
and
say that's true of all of these.
It's true of all of them. And at the very end, we talk about ways of working. And I think there are 2 ways of working that we want to embrace, which was a big part of the evaluation recommendations. The evaluation recommendations were support schools in implementing the kind of critical practices that we know work. All right, have a strong support, implementation, and accountability plan for those things. We don't need to pilot and experiment in those areas. And become much more nimble at innovating in the areas where we're struggling to learn what good looks like across the district. And I think this is one of those areas where there may be a small set of fundamental practices that we want to have in play, and we want to begin to use the creative problem-solving process to try out innovations, learn from them quickly, fail quickly, as we often say, and move on. So we can talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I think that's going to be relevant all the way through.
TJ wants to make one comment, then let's move
Yeah,
on.
I just
sounds
want to make
good.
a quick suggestion to our survey team, which is that question about aligning beliefs has come up repeatedly. And I think that supplementing that question in future surveys with actual belief statements and whether people agree with them or not would help us understand that a lot better.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think that one factor is that and this is just a guess, is that one factor is that is the first opportunity for people to say something negative about the BEP and the survey itself. And that, so it gets, and we really don't understand what doesn't align. And I think, so by supplementing with, do you believe that exclusionary practices are harmful to students? Do you believe, you know, blah, blah. I mean, those kind of things would help us understand that, because that always comes up, and it is a very high number. So.
If I come in once more on TJ's point, which I think is apt, I'd add that it might take a little longer, but you might also find what are your potential hooks.
Yeah.
What are the things that most people do commit to, and then you can at least build around it. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's both to diagnose the challenge, but to find that there are some things that people do commit to.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go on to lesson number 2.
All right, number
This one
2.
might be a little shorter and more
Yep.
direct, yeah.
Yeah, so
Maybe,
that really
wow,
is
who knows?
I would say mindset is the most complex piece of this work, and thus why it takes us longer to discuss.
right.
So we'll try to go a little more quickly. I just want to point out that the lessons build upon each other,
Yeah.
and we think about the importance of how implementation builds, but also 3 years in, we have to tend simultaneously to multiple areas. So we are thinking about this sort of literally and logically, with a recognition that things don't always happen in a linear manner. So we, in our first reflection around systems and structures, we weren't surprised that school-wide behavior structures are needed. Like that wasn't necessarily like the deepest part of the lesson. Digging deeper, what we really did is we underestimated how the competing demands of the impact of implementation impact the time for the development of and maintenance of those foundational behavior systems. And that's particularly true at secondary. So moving forward, we plan to continue to support elementary schools in the development and maintenance of foundational practices, school-wide behavior response being an example, which is also featured in a case study about Lindbergh Elementary. So that concerted focus on building the foundation will be most critical, especially in secondary schools, emphasizing our role in teaching and reinforcing the expectation of scholarly behavior. So as David talked about, this work is easier at elementary, as they're more, elementary schools are more typically used to teaching behavior, and it is viewed as more of a shared instructional priority. Whereas students get older, they're often expected to know how to behave, and our teaching practices tend to differ. So we believe that proactive foundation and predictable practice will decrease the number of behavior incidents that ultimately lead to exclusionary practices and exclusionary discipline. And as with all areas of implementation, we always need to be cognizant of how we're being culturally and linguistically responsive and disrupting inequities rather than contributing to inequities. But ultimately, this implementation focus area is really about building systems so that we decrease behaviors.
Yeah, and just to punctuate a little bit, I think that, and I could say this as a former secondary teacher and instructional coach, teaching behavior just looks really different at secondary, right? It's more about non-cognitive skills. It's more about habits and scholarly behaviors. And then it's less about how to walk down the hall in a single line. Just it's a more sophisticated thing, and it is, I think, very much the responsibility of the secondary teacher to explicitly teach those kinds of behaviors. What does it take to be successful in school? And it actually reminds me of the graduate vision, right? The larger set of skills and abilities that we want every student to attain before they graduate high school. So why don't we open it up there, a team or any board member? Yeah, go ahead, James.
I think the challenges of this kind of stuff at secondary are great, both structurally and also you're dealing with adolescents.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. But when we talk about school-wide systems and of reinforcing positive behavior, which was I think the title of the slide, kind of I've switched with thing. We've been doing PBIS in our district for a long time. Some elementary schools for a decade, close to it. And when we look at the survey data, you get like at our elementary schools are at 53% fully of practices fully in place. I think that raises the question, what's going on here? That after a decade's worth of work and a lot of investment of time, effort, professional development time, staffing allocations, I would assume trainings of PBIS coaches, you hit 53%. And then, kind of leave that to hang there for a second and hope that there is some kind of answer, because if this is the best we can do, then that's, that's a problem. The second one is that one of the things that, and I have to say that there was a lot of wonderful and deep and thoughtful analysis and creative analysis in the evaluation, but one of the things I saw missing was some kind of sense to connect the PBIS implementation data to other data. And I don't know if that exists. I mean, if there are connections or not. But I would think that, again, if we continue to be committed to PBIS as a system, we want to know that our schools that are better at implementing PBIS having better climate survey data. Are they having better intervention outcomes? I think that those connections are something that I think that there are questions that need to be asked, or because maybe we don't want to be continuing committing to PBIS. So those kind of two things related to PBIS.
I want to speak to that a little bit. I think it's interesting, right? Looking at across all 32 elementary schools, I think this idea of we've been doing, right, PBS for a decade. I think what that looked like from school to school was very different. And the quality of implementation versus just being able to say, yes, we have PBIS in place, I think was very different from school to school. And in many ways, the implementation of the BEP became really like a revealing tablet for how strong those systems actually were in schools, who really understood them, and what structures and systems were maybe not in place that schools maybe had overstated or overreached as far as being in place over the years. There were many schools that maybe even were schools of maybe distinction on paper, but when you actually stepped inside of the school to see how those practices really lived in real time, you can tell a lot about the health of really the quality of implementation of PBIS. There are a handful of schools that I know for sure that strengthening their PBS systems has had a tremendous impact both on climate for students and for staff. Schools like Falk, Mendota, Lindbergh, places where the conversation around disruption was pervasive 3 years ago. We couldn't really get to conversations around instruction because folks were really saddled with conversations around behavior. Focusing on those school-wide systems and those foundational supports has done a world of difference in those schools, and I think even opened up the door to a lot of the student achievement trends that you see trending positively in those schools. So again, we were doing PBS for a decade, but the quality of that implementation and consistency across schools, I just think was a different story, and implementation of the BEP just further revealed that.
Okay, Nikki had.
I don't have the exact page, but what I do have is I remember reading in the document that a large number of our students say they don't, of African American descent, say they don't feel safe at school. That worries. Sorry. That worries me a great deal. If we're doing PBIS, if we're doing this across all schools, why do we have such a high number of dissatisfaction? I know that's not really much of a solution, but I'm just curious of the reason for it.
I can start, but I think any of you guys should chime in. We are equally as concerned about it. Our climate data, we've seen some really nice improvements, but the group that we're most worried about are the students themselves, which are often in conflict with adult perceptions about of climate in school. And when you really start digging into the specific questions, they become even more revealing. And the questions about student sense of belonging in particular are very revealing for African American students, which again points back to why we've chosen to focus on culturally responsive teaching, on relationships between teachers and students as a major priority area. Yeah, can I pass it over to David?
You know, PBIS, if implemented well, can, at least in elementary schools, do a lot. But just like research, it's necessary but not sufficient. It does not create connection. It alone does not create the social and emotional competencies in kids. It does not produce engagement and things like that. And I do think that cultural responsiveness is an important way. I highly recommend, if you haven't read it, and you may have brought her in, but Zaretta Hammond's book on cultural responsiveness, because I really think that, and brain development, I think she understands the brain literature. I like her a lot. I'm using her a lot.
That was not a plan. I promise you that was not a plan.
Okay. Could you repeat that? I am a great fan of hers, and 2 books I'm writing right now, she's writing pieces of it, and I actually asked her to be in addition to our peer review, a critic of the science papers we have, out of my great respect for her. But let me add, not a but. In the end, if you want to know why young people don't feel engaged, the best place to find out is by listening to young people. And it may take time, but I can tell you my experience across the world, including with very, very angry young people, including those who are incarcerated. If you give them enough time and they know they're being taken seriously, they also will take these issues seriously and give you a sense of what's happening. But it's not going to happen easily. But I think if you want to find out how to do it, you need to listen to them. In the same way that if you want to find out how teachers can do the stuff they do, you have to listen to teachers.
My question is, all this discussion is good. We're talking about a lot of different things, a lot of different pieces that goes into raising achievement, whether it be student input. But one of the things we're talking about in the district now is how do you make strong relationships. Yeah. Building relationships with the kids, how the staff build stronger relationships. So in all of your work across all the places you've been, have you been somewhere where maybe there was an elephant in the room? Where, there's this one piece, if we could just really get a grip on that, that it can propel you to places that you're trying to get. For example, you started your talk off by talking about race. And in my view, I always try to remind everyone that what we're doing here is expressing all of our opinions. In my view, in my opinion, is that one of the things that I find this community is very bad at is talking about race. Owning up to the race issues that we have. And even in our buildings, we have a very difficult time talking about that issue of race and how it relates. We just showed a video of our student body, kids of color, talking about how they didn't feel welcome in school and those types of issues. There was very little response to it, which really took me back. And so have you been places where there's been maybe an elephant in the room and
Sure.
that could propel you?
Yeah. And it's possible you have read the book that I'm also going to recommend that I think is highly of as Zaretta Hammond's book, and it's Howard Stevenson from the University of Pennsylvania's book on racial literacy that really talks about the elephant in the room, and I think does it very, very powerfully, and I really recommend it. And Howard's work is very, very interesting, including the work he does with angry young men and trying to give them scripts that they can use to try to preserve their dignity. And I could learn from that, and I respect Howard a lot, in giving teachers scripts about how they can interact with a kid who's saying, using this finger in a different way verbally, and not feel that it's personal. I think we all need helpful scripts that make us feel that it's not just about us. Okay, so the answer is yes. I may have used this school before, and if I did, I apologize, but I'll give you two things that I learned from young people. Okay. One was interviewing young people at North Lawndale College Preparatory Academy in Chicago back in 2005, 2006, I forget. And one of the things I was doing there, I guess I didn't do it because I see Jen's face, okay, that I'm in this place, I'm listening to young people, and one of the things I'm hearing is that they're experiencing more academic challenge than they had in other places. I wasn't brought in there. I was brought in there because they were fighting. And so I said to them, are you ever pushed too much? And they said to me, no, never pushed too much. And so I then went back and said, but wait a second. I've heard you say about this and this and this and this. I can't believe that you haven't sometime been pushed too much. And what they said to me individually and as a group is the teachers have our backs. Now, when you read Zaretta Hammond's book and she talks about cultural responsiveness and is creating zones of intellectual safety, that's about having teachers have our backs. Now, out of a different project, I had the privilege of interviewing about 15 Mexican-American students north of Dallas, who were a select group because they were connected to the League of United Latin American Citizens. But I asked them a set question, which is, what advice would you give a teacher to make a class work better? And the first part of it is an obvious one, but it could help, which is get to know my name and call me by it. But the second thing blew me away because it just cut to the other elephant. They said, get to know what embarrasses each student and never do that. Because the other elephant for everybody, kids as well as adults, is fights over dignity. It's not wanting to be embarrassed, not wanting to be humiliated. And I think why I bring that up is that in a way, I didn't realize it was going to come here, but I can. It's hard for people in a society that does not promote racial literacy to have conversations that are very, very messy if you haven't had the experience of having them and knowing that in the end, even though it may be painful, you can come out okay. But it's important to do, but it means creating zones of safety and having ways that people can, in effect, have their own personal dignity and at the same time be able to talk about what's hard for them. Okay? So I hope that answers your very good questions.
I don't remember what I was going to say, but I did want to point out that you've actually gotten us into our third focus area, James, just so that we're ready to say one last thing on that whenever you are.
Did you want to say something else before we move forward?
Just a quick comment around, and it ties in nicely what you're talking about, dignity, that looking at these school-wide systems and teaching proactive, positive behavior, I just want to make sure that when we're talking about behaviors that we deem scholarly or positive or proactive, that those behaviors aren't, taking away people's dignity that may not have those same behaviors. So really being mindful of that when we determine what these scholarly behaviors will be looking like in the schools. Because I think that's a good point. That people don't like to be embarrassed for things that may not even be within their control.
That's excellent.
So the relationship idea, and I'm glad you brought us to it. It feels to me like it's core to this whole conversation, and I guess I'd love to have a conversation about what does create, what are the necessary and sufficient, what do we do to build relationships? What are the choices we make? And we've I think kind of among all of us talked about attitudes, right? Staff attitudes and student attitudes, and structure as kind of two buckets. The structural bucket can get really big, right? We could be talking about middle school start times and having students come to school just feeling better, right? We could be talking about class sizes. We could be talking about a lot of big levers that we could pull that are sort of outside of the behavior realm, but may have a bigger impact. And so I guess I'd love your thoughts on some of those big structural levers. I mean, there's one way to read this report, which says we spent incrementally at least $4 million a year more over the last 2 years each year, and nothing changed. Right? There is a way to read it. I don't think that's incredibly accurate, right? We have moved the needle at elementary, we've set some foundational work. But those resources, from my perspective, are up for grabs to try other things and to drive some of the innovation that I hope we come back to at the end. So I guess I'd be curious, writ large, not kind of narrow. How do you build that relationship?
It looked to me like, Nikki, did you want to say something? Okay,
No,
you said, okay. Let me start with a proposition which is general, and I think is a challenge that we face in education, but the human services. And maybe in the rest, in fact, probably in the for-profit sector, and we just don't know it as well, is that there really is a critical level of good enoughness that we often don't get to, so that when we do things, we don't get to the point where we're doing it well enough to produce something. And this is not to argue about your point, because I think it's really well taken, but I think in general that's an issue. It's the issue that came up in terms of PBIS and things like that. And we often don't know what is good enoughness. In fact, and that's one of the things I'm trying to figure out is how do you, in other work I'm doing, is what is really sufficient to make a difference. And knowing that it's going to be different for different kids, because let me add one other thing that we now know even more and more. Everybody's journey is individual, even though everybody's journey is socially influenced. Okay, learning is jagged. We may come to the right place, but we come in different ways. And that also means that what works for one person fully is not going to work for another, and we need more of an ability to really adjust for that. Okay, but now let me sort of move in. I think that there are some foundational things that could be done that can make a difference. I'm actually, it's ironic that tomorrow morning, I don't know if it's going to work or not, but I have a meeting before I get here. We have, funded by the National Institute for Justice, a randomized controlled trial in New York City of a safe spaces initiative that's trying to change how kids experience each other and adults in the halls as they're moving between classes and things like that, and really trying to equip teachers with how to better respond, among other things, to young people. And I'd be happy to put you in contact with the people that's engaging ed. It used to be Educators for Social Responsibility, who are doing the intervention that's really trying to do things. But part of it's literally equipping people with the ability to smile. Not just because smiling is good, because when I smile at you, you end up smiling back at me. And if I go back to the science, the stuff that I've had the great privilege over the last 6 months to read in much more detail and not be a dilettante anymore. I'm learning. I'm not an expert. When I look at you and I smile and you talk, all sorts of things are happening at all sorts of different levels, and that's what we want to have. Is we want to really harness biology in favor of relationship, and harness relationships in terms of de-stressing people so that we support biology, and in both cases we're supporting learning. And it really is a teacher smiling, a teacher not just knowing what not to do in terms of what embarrasses somebody, but also a teacher knowing what a child likes to do. And I suspect that while you'd like it had to happen for every student, and it should, so that one investment that people can make is making sure that there is some adult who really deeply knows a child, and I would say who can also identify that child's strengths and can pass it on to others. I think that's possible within a school. But in addition, I think even though I want to go back to James's elephant, we live extraordinarily segregated lives. And social networking, as we know, has only reinforced it more. And what we need for those 50% of the teachers who in part responded to too simple a question, but still responded in a negative way, many of them don't have an opportunity to ever see the child who they're not identifying with in terms of her or his strengths, to more deeply understand. I mean, there is a trope across the country that I keep on hearing, and it's very real. It's ongoing anecdotes. It's David shows up at school chronically late, but instead of just turning him into a truant, people ask David, why are you turning out late? And lo and behold, people find out that David comes late because he has to drop off his sister at one place and drop off his brother at another place because his parents are working 2 jobs and things like that. And the minute people hear that, they start not just looking at David as a chronic absentee or truant, but they start thinking about him in a different way, and they start to behave in a different way. And so it's in part finding those ways that build on our common humanity, that build on the fact that people went into education because they want to do a good thing, and then at the same time equipping them with tools. It's not just that, so that they can do it well. Okay, that's...
So what I hear you saying is to maintain a very targeted focus on skills, tools, practice around interpersonal interaction, right? Kind of that targeted focus around the one, really a one-to-one interaction, right?
And and doing it in a culturally responsive manner.
So I think in lieu of, and this is maybe a question, some of the other choices that we as a district could make around particularly time and structure, so block schedules, right? There are structural choices that we can make to support that some might argue would facilitate that type of relationship building, very different than kind of the training, skill building, practice, building comfort, et cetera, around. So they're kind of different choices.
So let me make your case.
Let me make your one path.
Let me make your case further. I think that's a possibility, and I think from my perspective, a right possibility, maybe the right. Comer again, who I quote, James Comer said a while ago that relationship in education is like location in real estate. Okay, it's really there. Okay, if you read the best neurobiological literature and the best literature on developmental science, even though learning is individualized, as I said, it takes place in relational context. And if you want another book to read Todd Rose's book, Beyond the Average, which is to talk about the individuality of learning, but it takes place within the context of relationships. But you want to do it so that every teacher is able to be more able to be in what educators call the zone of proximal development for every student, and that changes every day. And the more I know you, so let's say Anna's the student I know, the more I'm able to understand where she is, even on different days, but the more I have a relationship with Anna, the more likely she is to be able to be honest with me about where she is as well. Okay, and so we leverage that. And then, because Anna actually is connected to Nikki in some way, and so if Anna starts experiencing me not as harsh Dr. Osher, but as the warm and fuzzy person that I want to be, maybe she passes it on to Nikki, who's even less trusting, who may give it a chance. And so my own sense, and it's not just mine, I mean, this is what developmental systems, dynamic developmental systems thinking is all about, and that's where I think the best science is that relationships are controlling. And so if you can put your focus in on that, you get better academics, not less. You get better academics because teachers can teach better, and learners will learn better.
No, go ahead, John.
I was going to move us on, so go
Yeah,
ahead.
that's what I guess in moving on,
Yeah.
I think I'm not hearing, you can have 30 kids in a classroom and have a teacher who really has those skills and has that motivation and has that sense. And they could do better than a teacher who has 15 kids in the classroom and plenty of time, but just is not in that mindset, or maybe is that. So I guess I just don't want to take something away from this that says that we need to, the emphasis should be on structural changes.
Exactly the opposite.
Okay, I just want to make sure that that's,
No,
I didn't want
this is very,
Yeah.
no, that's right,
Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, it is, all things being equal, it's obviously easier to teach a smaller
Yeah.
number of kids.
Yeah.
But
Right.
the issue of how you do it could be, created even in big classes. You'd have to have very, very different strategies. You'd have to have very different supports, and you'd need a lot of coaching from most people because it's not something they're intuitive in, and you'd have to give them supports to handle the stresses of all this, because there's lots of cognitive load being taken if I'm trying to really be watching everyone at the same time.
But I think I'm thinking actually about the African American the student council that we met with at the end of last year, who in part the MSAN students created the video that you referenced, James, at the beginning of your comments. Their message, and I agree with it entirely, is that ideally it's both. Like ultimately it is about the relationship. And the work that we're doing with Zaretta is so incredibly important and powerful in building, in generating trust, which is, you do that not just because of your mindset, you do it through strategy, right? There are actual actions that you take in order to build it. But that the structural changes that we're making, if we do them with a specific goal of using them to build trust or to generate stronger relationships, they'll be even more powerful, right? You can create structural changes all day long and they won't make any effect, but if you leverage them to build stronger relationships, then and it's both and, right? In an ideal state. So pathways at the high school level, we could change all the structures and end up with the same product, right? If we're not leveraging them for stronger relationships, we could do all this academic and career planning work at the middle and high school level, and it won't change anything, right? It's relationships always at the center.
There are
So
two.
John,
Okay.
I will, because I'd love to hear your comment on this, and it might tie in. And just before we leave relationships,
Yep.
is also defining what the relationship is. And belonging, I think, is a very good word. I don't feel it goes far enough. And a word that I like is worthiness. Because belonging means, it sort of feels like, yeah, you're in the classroom, yeah, you're here, I make you feel like, you have a good seat. But if what we are aiming for is that every student feels in that interaction a sense that the teacher believes they're worthy of their time, worthy of learning,
Respected,
worthy,
valued,
and that
validated.
worthiness is, I think, something that goes beyond, that I think isn't captured with belonging.
I think your point is correct, okay? I mean, in the same, analogously, while we know everybody needs at least one adult at schools, my experience in places is I see places where every student can identify one good teacher, and then they also talk about other teachers who are and undo it. That it's not that feeling that belonging isn't important, but it's not enough. It's really is that I belong here. That I'm not an imposter, and that the people around know that I belong here. So it's both believing that you are worthy if you want, but also that others experience you and see you as worthy.
Yeah. Let's go on to lesson 4. Oh, sorry, TJ.
In some sense, this, circles back to some of the discussions around the relationships with academics, and one of the things is that in frustrations and stresses, that when we have students in classes they are not prepared for, and in a sense they know they don't belong there, and they know that this is going to be a struggle, this creates stresses for the students which can be manifested, and often are manifested, in resistance. And I think that one of the things that, and I think we especially experience this, our teachers experience this at the secondary level, particularly the high school level, where we have things where very, very few options other than algebra for 9th grade mathematics. And if you just look at, of limited use, but the test score data we have of 8th graders, it's clear that a significant percentage of our 8th graders are not ready to be doing high school algebra. Yet we are putting them in those classes. And therefore, this is creating a sense where they don't feel worthy, they don't feel they belong, they don't feel prepared, and and this is a structural thing, but it makes it very, very difficult for teachers. And and that starts on the first day of class, because one strategy, and you talked about survival strategies and how people deal with stresses. One strategy is to distract from what you're not prepared for. And so I think that we do need to be, and the obvious long-term answer is to have kids go into 9th grade prepared to do algebra. But we have a number of students who are currently in our middle schools who are probably not going to be there. And I think that we need to understand and provide either alternatives in terms of the academic work for those students, or special kind of supports for the teachers who have to address that. But one of the two, because if we, that this isn't working at that level. So, and it's not they're not capable; it's that they're not prepared. So, and mathematics is particularly a place where that's you build.
I think in some of the cases there may be a third alternative. I mean, I think you identified the issue correctly, and that is because for the kids who would benefit if they could succeed in algebra, and they're in 9th grade, they can't wait for being back upstream, it would require a commitment on the part of the district to say, we believe you are worthy enough that we're going to give you the intensive additional support so that you can do that. And it's a message which is slightly different.
I guess I would include that in the alternatives that I was saying,
yeah,
alternative
sure.
ways, and that would be certainly one alternative, and probably the most positive one.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I think it's very, very complex, and when people experience themselves as being unprepared or underprepared, and they're not given the supports to succeed, it really affects you. And at the same time, and I think you know it, and Zaretta Hammond would talk about it, or I'm sorry, I keep on dropping, but these are good books. Read Claude Steele's book, Whistling Vivaldi, which is about stereotype threat.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking
amongst
about, too.
very, very talented, highly proficient people of color, and at the same time, what that does to them and things like that. And I think that's also about worthiness and experience, whether or not, every time someone sees you, they walk across the street.
Yeah, that's right. I will point out to the board that I did ask Barb to order copies of Zaretta Hammond's book for you, since we're all reading it and immersing ourselves in precisely what we've been engaging in this last 20 minutes, not just this year, but I have a feeling for years to come. I think it'll be great for us to have some common language to talk about culturally responsive practice that addresses issues like stereotype threat head-on. We need to learn how to not worry about our students so much that we don't provide them opportunities to excel. And I know you all get that. So, lesson number 4. Let's touch on social emotional learning.
So
Really, lesson number 4 is a recognition that school-wide practices, classroom practices, relationship building is foundational, but we also have to tend to that direct skill, the direct teaching of skills. And we truly believe that that universal and direct instruction in social emotional learning skills is as imperative for our 4-year-olds as it is for our 18-year-olds. And it looks different depending on the level and the complexity of skills, obviously build as students get older. But we're always challenging ourselves and pushing ourselves to have authentic opportunities for social emotional learning for our students, no matter what their age. And so for the past several years, as I think most of the board and the community know, we've been explicitly teaching social emotional learning skills, especially at elementary and middle school. So the last 2 years, in addition to the use of Second Step as well, our middle schools are also embedding the concept of academic and career planning within the social emotional learning standards and leveraging those two concepts in tandem. Moving forward, though, we really want to, in collaboration with our Department of Curriculum Instruction, to move beyond or in addition to the explicit of teaching of social emotional skills using a social emotional curriculum. We really want to see our teachers embedding social emotional learning standards and the demands that social emotional learning standards put on kids as a part of our classroom instruction. So we believe that explicit instruction within content areas is pivotal to decrease exclusionary practices and increase the amount of time students are meaningfully engaged in the classroom. We believe that if students are explicitly taught those pro-social skills, it will help facilitate that engagement and the need for removals from the classroom, and more importantly, the need for exclusionary discipline decreases quite considerably. We just know that tending to those social emotional needs in isolation is important, but it's not all. So we've really learned how critical it is to see in classroom instruction as well.
And I'll just link this back to Loretta Hammond and her book.
Yeah.
I think there are explicit links here that when students have stronger social emotional learning, they're able to become more independent learners. They can recognize in themselves what they need, express what they need, as opposed to dependent learners or lifelong dependent learners. We want to move them to be as independent as they can and should be. And social emotional learning is part of that.
Thank you.
Any questions or thoughts on this one? Yeah.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out when I can ask this question I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, frankly. But, and so I'm going to put it in here. We've imposed this structure on classrooms. Said we're going to mix in social emotive learning with your regular on day-to-day every classroom. If it comes up, maybe you have to flip in. We also heard about a structure just a few minutes ago where TJ mentioned that we impose an algebra structure on 9th graders that we have not had a lot of success with. A whole lot of kids, 4 years ago, it was 1 in 4 failed it. And we know what happens to a kid who fails one class in 9th grade, going on and on. So when we impose these structures, that's an example of, I think, a structure we need to look at. Does every kid in 9th grade need to take algebra if 1 in 4 failed 4 years ago? And it's gotten better, well, because we've tried to address it, we made a priority, but there's still a high failure rate. And so my question, as with those two examples, is what's the trade-off? I'm willing to trade off more social emotive teaching in an algebra class so that they can learn how to do school and not fail, as opposed to the academic success of getting everyone algebra passed in 9th grade when it ain't happening. So for me, it's a legitimate structural change-off to let everybody give them into a class that they can pass. Some won't won't succeed, but not at the rates that algebra shows us. So I don't want that. And I'm not trying to say we shouldn't teach algebra. For everyone needs that. It's that they weren't ready. They weren't prepared, and we forced them in there, and then we forced a failure on them. And now what do we do? Now it impacts all of them. So what's the trade-off? How much? I'm willing, and I don't believe fully, because I need to hear some support for it. But in many cases, I'm willing to have an entire class or several students spend half their day on socially emotive stuff as opposed to academic stuff, because once we get that right, they'll pick up the academics later. That's my belief. So what's the trade-off here?
I feel like the two work together, Dean. We teach them the social emotional skills in order to carry a stronger cognitive load. I think one of the biggest lessons I think we're missing and not talking about from this past year around the implementation of our math curriculum at the elementary level is around what happens when you give students, even who are not yet at grade level in math, access to grade level instruction and what it takes to help those students to become successful. I think you would think that implementing a more rigorous curriculum, you would have saw student achievement drop, right, in elementary. We actually didn't see that. We actually saw it go up and go up even more for African American students who traditionally had not been successful in math. That is about access and about leveraging the kind of social emotional skills that we're using, not just so that you are just a more developed student, but that you use those habits of mind to be able to persevere, to be able to persist through problem solving, and to actually engage in more rigorous content. So I think it's not what are you willing to trade, but how do you leverage one for the other? Because we still want them mastering content in their subject areas, but I think it's not which one are we willing to trade, but just how do you leverage one for the other. That's a huge lesson from this past year. People underestimated and were even scared. Oh my God, what's gonna happen when students try this more rigorous math curriculum? And students actually not pleasantly surprised me, because I knew they could do it, but they rose to the occasion. So it's less about which one do we trade, but how do we better prepare, I think, our educators to help students with the skills and dispositions that they need to carry a stronger cognitive load. And that's work that just we haven't done well.
Yeah, I would agree. And if I could just say, I definitely hear and agree with the frustration around algebra, but I think we're actually required to do both, Dean, primarily because oftentimes in secondary, going back to Nancy's earlier comments about how PBIS and social emotional learning are perceived, particularly in our second schools, is a separate thing. And it's not fully integrated into how kids experience core classrooms. And so kids who are in math or in social studies and they don't necessarily have access to the environments that affirm who they are, create the conditions, not just for belonging, because I actually would agree with Mary there, but we do need to look at alternative and supplemental supports for algebra. That's clear. But we just can't do that without building the capacity and creating the supports both for our teachers to integrate effectively these social emotional learning, both supports and mindsets. Because we have classrooms where teachers are integrating well, not with perfection, where we've got 100% of our students passing algebra. But it's happening. We just have to do it more systemically and provide the adequate supports to do it.
Okay, Nikki.
Although I see the educational point, I have to agree with Dean on this particular one. And my argument is as follows. You are dealing, especially in middle and high school, with emotional, hormonal, social beings. They are kids. We are not dealing with many adults. Whether or not you want to teach the social and emotional or solely focusing on the academic, I don't think you can ignore it. In fact, I know you can't ignore it, because socially, coming from someone who had her own social challenges based on my autism diagnosis, socially is more difficult. When you're focusing on that, it's really hard to learn anything else. There's there is a way where we can include it, and we need to include those social skills to make sure they understand it. And frankly, I think Dean's right. Some kids aren't not ready for algebra in 9th grade. I can tell you I didn't get it until 11th, and there was a good darn reason for it, because I was still flipping my numbers backwards, and I would have never passed it. Except it would have crushed me if I failed it. And I don't want to do that.
Do you want to comment quickly? What's in Anna and Nick?
I do. I mean,
We look alike.
I think that I agree with both. I think that our high schools, middle and high schools, are not yet structured in a way to attend to the needs of adolescent learners. And they are heavily focused on identity development, figuring out who they are, figuring out who their people are, their social networks. It does take up a lot of time and energy for kids. It involves a lot of stress, I think, for a lot of students, which eats up more of their brain capacity. And so I want to make sure everyone knows I don't think we should be ignoring it either. I don't think that's what Alex or Nancy is saying. And I do think that there are situations where there should be very unique plans, like the plan that Nikki described for herself growing up, where that is absolutely the best route. So I don't want to get into a big debate about it, because I think we agree. We don't want to lower the bar for kids. We want to provide better spaces for them to safely go through the experience of being an adolescent, and find different routes when we need to find them for an individual student. So I just agree with all of that, Dean. I think I'd actually be curious what David thinks on this one too.
I agree. It's actually both, and it also means, I mean, where there may be two structural issues that one could think about is one, over time, how do you really respect and support the individuality of kids' learning? So I want to build on Nikki's point about herself in terms of the fact that, but I also want to connect it back then to Mary, of an environment that really embraces the fact that we can all get to the same place, but we get there in different ways, and all because someone's ahead of someone else in one thing does not mean that that matters. It's where we end up that is what matters. And so that's a very, very different mentality, and it includes amongst everybody. And I think the other thing is, how does one create, whether it's in a day or the timing of the year, and I think this is what Dean is raising in a certain sense, enough of the flexibility so people can learn algebra if they are, but time can be taken to support the other developmental things. And that goes back to the notion of, if I'm in a zone of proximal development with Anna, I know when today's not the moment for me to be teaching quadratic equations. Today is the moment for me to give her the space to deal with what she needs to deal with. And so it's creating an environment that can be more responsive. That's not easy, but I don't think it's impossible to create a nimble environment. And one of the things that is happening now is we're developing much better ways of measuring, and so that I think we can really get a much greater handle on where kids are. There are also different ways of using technology to help a little, not to replace teachers. But I mean, I think there are things that can be done that can create a greater personalization that's real. You know, that to end, I mean, Chan Zuckerberg, will see if they realize it, but Jim Shelton talks about whole child personalization. It's not just personalization, but understanding that individuality and supporting it. And I think that becomes more possible now than it did before. And particularly when we just say, this is such a great board. And I mean, it's really, I feel privileged to be sitting and listening to this conversation, as well as the district people, because this is about the struggles of learning. This ain't easy stuff, but it.
I like this focus area, and it goes back kind of to what I think part of what Dean is talking about is that we still live in a educational society that puts academics above social emotional learning, or I guess we call them soft skills because you can tell what we think about them. We call them soft skills. So I think this is important to do that, to embed it, because I know when teachers need to get through all the different things that they need to do, there is pressure to maybe set aside that second step lesson, or maybe it turns out to be like 10 minutes during circle time. And I don't think it's because they want to do that, but that's like the pressure there is placed upon academics. So I think another reason it's powerful is because you wouldn't take any other skill, if you're talking metacognition or something like that, and say, oh, we're practicing metacognition today, and then never tying it to where you'd be using it. And of course, you're going to use it across every academic area. So I think it needs to be embedded because that's just naturally how it should be. So I think I'll be excited to see what this looks like.
So I wanted to, I'm not sure this is exactly the right place to put it, but it seemed as good as any. The report talks a lot about a small number of students taking up kind of the majority of staff time, and I guess I kind of wanted to. These recommendations are somewhat universal in their nature. Many of them will apply to all students. I kind of wanted to zero in on how, if at all, we think differently about a smaller number of students, because when I see in the survey, and even maybe Mary in the climate data or in the attitudinal data that you referred to, is staff feeling like they are, and they are deciding in each moment which students to be attuned to, right? Which of their 17 students is it? You know, and often that in the commentary was, you know, is it the 16 or is it the 1? And so I guess I just love to hear your thoughts on how do we, or do we have a different set of work to do around that smaller set of students or not? And I don't know.
I think that actually gets us into the next area, so I'm going to use this opportunity to move us on. Yeah.
You did well. But don't wait on me. I had prepared before, so I know what's here. I'm back in a second.
Jen, you want me to jump past the number 5? We didn't specifically talk about it.
Yeah, I think jump past number 5.
Okay. All right. So jumping into number 6 is a perfect tie to Kate's question. And with your permission, I would actually like to combine 6 and 7 because I think your questions for those are going to be relatively similar, and potentially 7 will help 6. All right. So to Kate's point, the first several of our lessons learned were applicable to all students, regardless of whether or not they're demonstrating behaviors in our schools. So our lesson learned number 6 is a reminder to us that we need to have interventions that are targeted to build skill. And it's not surprising. We knew that, but what we underestimated is the pressure across the student services teams to be implementing multiple different pieces of the behavior education plan across multiple tiers of implementation. So for example, underestimated the amount of time it would take for student services to be involved in behavior response and how that would impact their ability to deliver systemic interventions. Emerson Elementary provides, though, a good model for us, and it's available as a case study for review. So you'll be able to see a little bit about how they are being intentional using their data to place students in interventions. They're striking that balance between the proactive and the reactive systems, which is critical and is also really difficult. An intentional focus on the development of those systems that engage students in interventions aligned with the function of their behavior must occur to K-12. So I think we have been using intervention, or we've been using intervention or response strategies, but the depth to which we are going, I'm so sorry. Thank you. The depth to which we are digging, I didn't even see what who the person was, I just saw a finger. The depth to which we are developing automaticity around intervention and getting students placed in intervention using proactive and reactive data alike is an area of growth for us. Additionally, and I didn't talk about this during when we were talking about some of the relational work, but it's super critical for us to be doing with students instead of to students. So how are we bringing them along with us as leaders in this work rather than them sort of being the recipients of our intervention? And so, especially at secondary, but across the board, how do we leverage peer-to-peer accountability systems such as youth court, restorative circles, and explicitly youth court or a restorative circle as possibilities, and explicitly teaching the skills, a skill in intervention rather than just a what not to do. And we believe and we know that in doing this, we can decrease our rates of suspension, most specifically our rates of recidivism, or our students who are being suspended multiple times for similar behaviors. So teaching that targeted skill so that they have a new fund of knowledge to draw from in a situation that might be similarly challenging as what they experienced pre-intervention. So there's that piece, and then lesson 7, I just want to connect, is, and I alluded to this, is the importance of student services folks, our psychologists, social workers, counselors, nurses, PBIS coaches, et cetera, in the development of universal systems. And we need them to support our universal systems, but we also really need them to be digging into work that is aligned with their professional expertise. So in the absence of those proactive or systematic intervention systems, intervention practices, our student services become firefighters out of true necessity for how the day-to-day, how they're experiencing their day-to-day life. However, we truly believe that if our student services members could be in more of a Smokey the Bear sort of role as opposed to the firefighter putting out fires versus preventing the fires, we think that we can have, we can experience greater success. And so it's that balance of responding in the moment and having these outstanding professionals available to respond in the moment, but also protecting their time and creating the space for those proactive interventions and the utilization of their incredible and deeply personalized, professionally personalized set of skills. So we think about those two things have to work together. Implementation of interventions and role alignment can't happen in isolation of one another.
I know we're not changing the plan tonight or bet you until the spring, but just one way that this could help is if you go through the elementary behavior education plan, we have 11 pages on intervention and we have 27 pages on discipline. Very simply, if we're going to have a discipline as the consequence, I think we need more intervention before we enact that consequence.
I'm sorry. I'm glad that particularly the second part of this is opened up, and the triage that as opposed to preventative and supportive work for both our students and our teachers is always been a balance that's difficult, and does lead to stresses and feelings of crises, particularly in some schools at some times. And I guess that as we, as Nikki alluded to, we're not going to rewrite the plan tonight. We're not going to restaff the plan tonight. But as we look towards next year, particularly with restaffing the plan, the budget amendment Anna put forth 2 years ago was designed to address exactly this issue, which was that we had these wonderful firefighting teams that were also very skilled in providing supports, but they were too stressed, so let's add another team. It appears that maybe one team wasn't sufficient. And as we go forward for next year, what is the balance between our professional district level teams, our school-based professional teams, our paraprofessionals, and related things in terms of budgeting without spending more money, but rather redistributing among what we are currently doing. Because I think that one of the things that, I think after that first year, you know, we knew that we needed to staff higher. There was some thought in it, but there was also a lot of throw some people at it, and without and then, you know, as we go, those roles have been defined. But I think that the analysis around, you know, what are the most effective roles? Can we put up with fewer BEAs temporarily that will create some crises if we create these other structures of support that one would hope would mitigate the need for that many BEAs in the end. So I hope that kind of thinking goes into the next budget cycle.
Mary?
So my question is also around the staffing. And I think it might be sort of a different side, and I really appreciate Dr. Osher's insights, because one question I have had over the last 6 years is that we have seen increase in a lot of staff positions that are around the interventions, the assistants. They're not the norm, they're not the regular faces that student sees. And so when we're talking about relationships, we're adding a lot, we have a lot of staff. And in fact, if you just took all of our professional staff and took our number of students and divided it, we could have incredibly small class sizes, incredibly small. We have one of the highest staffing ratios in the state. And so it seems to me like you have a disconnect between the building of the relationships, that the trust, when we put so much of our resources on the whether it's Smokey or whether he's putting out fires or whether he's prevention, versus the people in the faces in the classroom every single day. And I've heard from teachers who say, you know, I don't need another specialist, interventionist, this and that. If I had a few less kids, I could really do that. So this is a big, when he talks about structural issues, that's one that I have on my mind, and my gut feel is that more on the teachers in the classroom, resources, time, relationship building, skill building in how to intervene and all those, and less on these others. But I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Sure. Let me also start with something else that, because I think you all are asking the right questions, including results. But let me add one other contextual feature that is probably worth understanding, but not avoiding not to avoid what you're talking about. Kids are not the same today as they were 2 years ago or 3 years ago. They're at greater levels of risk. I mean, and it's because of what's happening in society to their parents. It's also now what they're seeing as well. And so that's going on as well. I mean, you know, the more people have to work 2 and 3 jobs, the more stressed they are, the more they're on the internet at night working harder and harder, the less they're connecting with their kids, even their adolescents who need them sometime, and those take its toll. And if I'm a kid of color and I'm growing up in this society today, and I may be feeling slightly different and less hopeful than I might have been feeling a few years ago as well. And so I think that it's important to understand we're also dealing with broader contexts that actually come home to roost in Madison, just like in in classrooms. That being said, I think, I think you want, no matter what, the types of efficiencies that Lee was talking about and the tiered levels. But one other role for Smokey, if you want, is Smokey as the teacher's consultant, to help the teacher do more of his work, and in a sense that I think that independent of size, and I would never argue that less would not be better if you can afford to do it, as long as, as Jen said before, you equip people. That AIR did one of the 2 there was a great study of small schools done in Tennessee in early, experimentally back in the 1970s or early 80s, early 80s, that really produced results because people had the ability to do it. AAR and RAND studied the California small school attempt where the governor decided to immediately reduce it and just brought in any teacher he could to the schools, and basically there weren't results because you could reduce the size but not improve the quality. But I think job-embedded support and professional development of helping people do the sort of things that people have been talking about under the other points, like integrating academics and social and emotional learning, like supporting connectedness to kids and helping kids feel worthy, etc., is something that teachers may need additional support with if they're dealing with a young person who doesn't present as someone who wants to be helped, or is frightening to them. And so that, and I don't mean frightening because the person is frightening, but because the person's own experience are frightening to them, and they don't know how, they're afraid of opening things up. And so I think another way of thinking about the resources is also deploying them in more where appropriate in a consultative way, along with maybe having more people who are just helping teachers integrate everything.
I appreciate that comment because looking at this slide, one thing that I think is missing is classroom teachers. Because I think that's the key. We can't be thinking about that this is something where other people are going to come in and fix a problem. That it's about the classroom teacher is that foundational piece, and they need to have the training, the support. That's where, I mean, I think that, so if we could just change that and put classroom teacher on. I see this a lot too in regard to student services. We see this disconnect between beliefs around student services versus general educators, and I think part of that is that we continue to silo them as though this is your student, this is your student, this is your skill set, this is your skill set, and that's not how it works. I mean, we have an inclusive integrated school, so we have to share those skill sets, not to say that there can't be cases that you do bring in additional support, which is why I support the intensive support team, because they do both. They do skill building with the teacher and they support and wrap around the student and the family. But I would just really like to see our teachers be on this slide.
Additionally, I just want to clarify something I said. When I mean more issues on intervention, I don't necessarily mean people. Although, definitely I want to do as much for our classroom teachers as possible in the classroom and for the teachers and the students themselves. But an intervention can be in the classroom. An intervention doesn't always require people.
I was just going to circle back to Mary's point. I mean, my take from reading this was quite similar, that, we're talking about relationships between young people, and usually one adult is the most important adult in the room. Not always, but it's usually the classroom teacher that has the authority to distill worthiness into their students. And so, for me, enabling them to the degree we can, and maybe using support. What I'm hearing a little bit maybe from you, Dr. Osher, is supporting teachers and not directly supporting students. We're right now using quite a lot of paraprofessionals to intervene with students, which is confusing. It creates lots of dynamics, no single point, who knows the story, right? But maybe that support needs to actually move up a level to facilitate and enable our staff.
If I can, let me also add a possibility. Okay, often I've been telling you what I'm at least more confident in. This is more pulling together some things. One way of using some of your additional personnel is to free teachers up more for time they need to do in terms of developing the other things we're talking about. And if you had some people who also had relationships with students, not in the way that you're concerned with, you might be able to free up teachers at some points. And that I'm sure of, but now I'm going to add something. you know, even the best teacher cannot necessarily establish a relationship with everybody. And that's this is more a personal fit issue rather than anything else. And so if you have a few additional people who are not there as just specialists, but are around, you may have an opportunity where if someone does not get along with David, they can get along with Anna. And so I don't mean in terms of the specialist, but just really having a little more flex when necessary.
And maybe just to circle back to the idea of kind of not enoughness and resources, because ultimately this conversation is going to come back to resources, right? I mean, this is, it's been a major investment for the district, and it needs to continue to be. It feels to me like we're still in the make big shifts in how we're allocating resources, not small tweaks. I think we have a lot more experimentation to do, and if we take the big picture point away from the report and this, which is let's shift away from technical retroactive interventions and towards proactive relational interventions, our resources should be highly aligned with that, and they are not right now. So it's just, I think that we will have a conversation about that at some point, but it feels to me like there are big shifts.
Yeah, and I think we agree with that completely in terms of the administrative and staff team. I think that there's a lot to be learned about how we've staffed this particular work, but it is kind of a bigger question about resource allocation when it comes to staff. I mean, we had this discussion recently as it relates to special ed, and how do we more carefully, intentionally, and equitably use instructional aids in the classroom so that they're support for students, but not a barrier to their relationships with their classroom teacher and to other students. So I'm actually really excited about digging into that particular issue. I think we should move on to. Oh yeah, go ahead. Maybe not. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm sitting on the end here. I'm hard
Sorry,
to see.
I didn't see you over there.
Yeah, it's difficult for me as a board member, even though I've been here 4 years, to get my head around if we have enough staff doing this stuff. I've had, since I've been on the board, I go back and forth with John every year saying, man, you got enough people? If you need more, we'll give you, come on, you know, you got enough special ed? Because I don't think we do. Do we yet? You know, but it's always, I think. It seems like you don't. I don't know for certain because I don't do this work every day, and I'm assuming most of the people that are here are somehow connected to this stuff. Because after 4 years, I still don't know everybody's face and everybody what they do. Probably won't, and that's okay. So we learned quickly after the first year, even after some of us were saying, hey, I think you should put more in there. And next year, like, we doubled down because we probably should have put more in the first year. We learned that now. Now here we are after a pretty good eval, and I think I would double down now on saying I want to see a budget request that takes the recommendations here and makes it real and gives everybody a chance to do this properly, because I think if we do this properly, it will be transformative, not year to year, but over a stretch of time. And I think what's encouraging is the elementary stuff, but it's still not good enough. And so what are we learning here when it comes to staff allocation and resource allocation is something that I want to not think I get. I want to know what you're telling me, and so that I can support it properly if that's what we're going. Because this is a big deal to me. This thing is important to me, and if it's not resourced properly, we shoot ourselves in the foot and don't give anybody a chance, especially the in-class teachers, to be able to do what we're asking them to do with all the academic stress we're putting on top of them. Without getting this right, they'll never have a chance.
Yeah, which is why classroom teachers will always need the support of specialists and clinicians who can both provide consultative support, to David's point, and direct services to students when needed. The classroom teacher just can't be and do everything for their students and shouldn't be expected to. They are expected to have strong relationships with them. So, what do you think, James? Can we move on to the next
I think we
implementation
should
focus
move on.
area? Okay.
Yes.
Have you talked about the small set of higher needs students?
Oh, yeah, but maybe
Yeah.
not as directly as we
I
could
didn't,
have.
yeah.
Yeah.
I got lost
Thank
in
you.
the
Sorry about
slide.
that, Kate.
So I would say implementation focus area number 6 really is where we address the needs of our students who demonstrate the most intensive needs that are in our more of our comprehensive or traditional programs, not our alternative programs or our special education alternatives. We are not convinced that we have yet done our best work in having interventions that are responsive to data, that take into consideration the function of a student's behavior and match skill building interventions to the function of their behavior, that we progress monitor along the way. So I think to answer that, we are addressing the needs of some of our most intensive students through multiple strategies. But in our schools, when we see the behavior education plan in practice, we are really thinking about how we can improve upon the already existing structures and resources within our buildings to more deeply impact and support students that are demonstrating the most intensive needs, or those students who, as you referred to in the evaluation, are really accounting for the majority of our behavior issues. Yes?
Just thinking about next steps, and a lot of people talked about staffing for next year, and clearly there's BEP related things. I think that more generally, much of this integrating into the strategic framework work is very important.
Yeah,
be it social emotional learning, be it setting priorities around different things, that and to the extent that's possible as that work goes forward.
Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing, TJ.
Thank you.
I do very quickly, I think one of the things that we've talked about, just to maybe help make Leah's comment a little more tangible for board members, is even rethinking suspension and thinking of alternatives to
Yes,
suspension
thank you.
as an intervention for a student who is repeatedly having problems with behavior.
Thank you.
Is part of what we're thinking. And that's not just to say we don't want to put the suspension on the books, but because we think the alternative to suspension actually is going to help stop the behavior and support the student. That's exactly right.
Can I just add something really quick?
Yeah.
To Jen's point, one way, and again, the board can do as it wishes on this, have we thought of making behavior intervention plans to the officers currently? Because currently we don't always do that. And frankly, then the officer's in danger, the student's in danger, because neither of them know how to respond. I think if we did a simple HIPAA waiver, this could be done pretty easily. And I realize some people say it's forced self-identification. I understand that. At the same point, as to create the best intervention for the kid, I think everyone needs to know.
Yeah, Nikki, I'm glad you brought that up. I know, just having spoken with Joe Ballas the other day, this was part of our discussion, and I know that it's come up in both ad hoc committee as well as the working committee that is trying to strengthen the relationship between EROs and our schools. But I think it's really important that administrative staff and anyone who works directly with students are aware if they have a behavioral intervention plan and know who to go to if they need to learn more. So I appreciate that. Let's.
Yeah, I think we should do ways of working and lessons, ways of working, and then move on to our questions. We maybe can combine them.
I think we didn't do 5, but I think that's okay
We didn't
because
do 5?
that's more about hallways, and we talked about that a lot in May, and I think you guys probably have a pretty good handle on what we're doing with the more public spaces in schools, unless you want to. But I think that's pretty self-explanatory area, very important. Focus area number 8, though, I would like to spend a few minutes on it because I think it's critical if we're going to address disproportionality. So, Leah, if you could just say a few minutes.
Yeah. So as we think about each of these lessons learned and the implementation focus, we have an eye always towards disrupting racial disparities for our African American students and for our students with disabilities. But focus area 1, the mindset and the restorative approach, and focus area 8 are bookends for what we believe to be 2 critical action steps necessary to disrupt disparities in our behavior discipline. So we know that what we really learned is the importance of constant attention and space for those who are in decision-making seats to be able to think critically about how their decision is being made, what bias might be contributing to that decision, and really taking the time to slow down and objectively consider what discipline and or which intervention or which discipline in combination with an intervention we apply in this situation. So we need to be thinking about both how we do that to mitigate for suspension. So in particular, are our African American students receiving out-of-school suspension for similar behaviors to their white students who are typically getting in-school suspension? Or are our white students getting a half of day for a behavior that our black students are getting 3 days? So having protocols and systems to use when determining discipline is important. And equally as important is analyzing our data and reflecting on how our systems or our decision making at multiple levels of the system are perpetuating or preventing those disparities. So how does a teacher decide to call the office? How does a behavior responder decide if a call is an incident? How does a principal decide if they're going to give in school versus out of school? And most importantly, then looking at that data, as I said, to assess equitable application of policy in a discipline, and to assess our need to more deeply engage in equity work to mitigate and disrupt that bias. So one thing I just want to share, in your case study, you'll see that Principal Angie Hicks at Wright is featured, and the demonstration in her community to equity and restorative leadership using circles. So they are looking at their data and understanding where their inequities are, and are digging in more deeply and processing that through adult circles about equity. So a very quick point on a very complex and incredibly important part of our implementation.
There are many things that worry me on the expulsion practices. The fact that expulsions actually have gone up, not slightly. They said according to this in 2016, it's now back down. It said it here that in 2014 it went down, then it went up, now it went back down. I want to see why it's going.
I think that we had the post-expulsion program at that time, so students went through expulsion and went to the post-expulsion, and we have the and then we went to the expulsion abeyance instead.
Okay.
So
I wasn't here for that.
Putting kids through the expulsion was actually a way to have them access services that they now access through the recommendation for expulsion. So that's why that data goes.
That's what I was concerned about. But the other issue that I think can solve some of these problems is to have, when we do expulsion hearings, and I know they don't happen often, to have a set of criteria to keep it consistent. Because right now every court hearing examiner has their own procedure, and they differ significantly from one to the other on what's admissible, what's not admissible, whether they tell someone they have the right to answer, right to cross-examine, whether they don't. Those kind of things should be standard, because then you can have a standard set of punishment. Additionally, if you have a rubric, if you create an actual rubric and a checkoff system, so-and-so committed this behavior. If A breaks a window and B breaks a window and there's not disability involved, and there's not a manifestation involved, the punishment should not be different between A and B.
I do, this is just a side note actually, but on the expulsion data, it is important to note that the numbers have gone down on ultimate expulsions for the reasons that you're describing, TJ. And thank you to the board for allowing us to kind of experiment with some different ways of working on that. But the initial recommendations for expulsion have come down a lot, which means we're putting fewer kids just through the process, right? Which even if it doesn't result in an expulsion at the end of the day, is such a harrowing process and ultimately damaging, I think. So I'm very appreciative that even the number of recommendations have come down a lot. I think that's worth highlighting. Okay.
TJ,
Yeah, this reminds me of another place where perhaps we can have the survey dig in a little bit deeper next year. The perceptions of fairness of consequences among both students and staff, and particularly staff, if I recall correctly, but varying at different levels, are frighteningly low. And, you know, revealing a lack of faith in perhaps not the philosophy, but the implementation in a lot of ways. And this activity has an opportunity to take those both ways. It could take them higher, it could take them lower. And I guess that to be aware of that, and I think that also that to understand, you know, when people say that the consequences aren't fair, that means different things to different people. And we really don't know what people mean by that, other than that they have a lack of faith in the fairness of the system as a general observation. And so, I guess to the survey team again, if we can have sub-questions around that for next year, that will help us, and particularly if we're doing focus groups and things like that also. Though I do think the anonymous survey brings out that stuff better than a focus group does in many instances, especially when people don't have faith in the system. And then secondly, I think that an awareness around as if we're looking at what is being defined as more equitable decision making, the awareness of that dynamic is going to be crucial to the success of it.
The issue of fairness, just to quickly touch on that, has been something that we have talked a lot about as well. And we know that fairness, conceptions of fairness, are part of one's deeply cultural values and beliefs. So unpacking why our students are saying that things don't feel fair is really important to us, because it's not just a matter of right and wrong.
And I think Kate pointed out in the conversation we had that people are operating from limited information. That students, you know, see part of event, consequence, lack of consequences, don't see other parts of it. Same staff probably has access to a larger amount of information. This particularly interacts with things around special education issues where consequences and/or things are related to BIPs and IEPs, and so I think that's part of the story too. But still, you know, this doesn't work if there's not a fundamental faith in the fairness of what's being done, or the fairness and equity and fairness. I mean, you know, these are not identical. So I just want to highlight that aspect.
And yeah. But just let me say one thing that you can comment on. You know, when we talk about fairness, the thing that I'm always taken back about is that as we all board members have traveled across this district and talked to students, we talk to all students, not just African American students, but white students and Latino students. All of them talk about how the system is not fair for kids of color. All of them. So it's hard for me to get my head around when we start talking about interpreting fairness, because to me that's as clear and vivid as can be when everyone says the system is not fair. It'd be different if only African Americans said it, or if only white kids said it, or if only Latino kids said it. But talking to white students, they say, yeah, I can do this, but if he did it, it's going to be a different outcome. So, and it goes back to a comment you made 3 years ago, and I always wondered if I got it wrong. And that was that when we talk about disproportionality, it's not disproportionality in behavior. it's disproportionality in the outcomes. And I always wondered if I had that wrong or not, because that says a lot about what those kids are talking about.
Firstly, you got it right. Okay, it is, I mean, it's about disproportionality in outcome. I mean, I think if I go back to Nikki's point much earlier about intervention, it's also disproportionality in terms of what types of interventions kids get. I mean, to give you one piece of data that I did in the 1990s using a national longitudinal study of special education outcomes and just looking at kids with emotional behavioral disorders, because there's enough, and black and white students, because those were the two groups. And this is for emotional behavioral disorders. White students were more likely to get counseling.
Yep.
But then if you looked at just those kids who got counseling, black and white students got more of the counseling. That's an example of a disparity in terms of a preventive input, okay? So not only did you find black kids being in more segregated settings, but you had more white kids getting more counseling. Those are two things. You know, TJ's been mentioning a survey, so I want to tell you about a survey that might be of use, and it's free, okay? And at least to use one piece of it, okay? That we had a contract, and we created for the Department of Education a survey that's a suite of surveys for students, teachers, other school staff, and family members on school climate. It has 3 scales. Each one has 3 or 4 subscales. My favorite subscale in all cases, not just here, is one that is called cultural competence. I'd actually call it cultural responsiveness. And it actually asks students and then teachers in a related way, and other school staff in a related way, and families about issues that relate to perceptions of how people like you and how others are treated. And so it might be something that would be worthy of being administered. That there are different ways of doing it. I mean, because so I won't get into the technical details, but I think that set of items would be very, very useful. And we're completing a benchmarking process right now for the federal government, looking at representative places across the country, so there could be some benchmark numbers as well.
Anna.
Just going one, and maybe I misheard you, Leah, but kind of talking about we're talking about disproportionality between students with disabilities and African American students, and you kind of stated as 1 and 8 are the bookends. And I just would really encourage folks to look at that intersectionality.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
I think when you look at our data, and I'm looking at the circles, it's really troubling to me, because when I look at the circles in elementary, I see lots of big green circles, and the green circles are African American students with disabilities. And when I get to high school, I see very few. And to me, that doesn't tell me that we've done anything, but it tells me that they're no longer in our schools and they're someplace else. And I could be wrong, but that's kind of an assumption I'm making. And so just really making sure that we are hearing from African American students with disabilities, because sometimes people without disabilities make a lot of assumptions and can give information that can be harmful to people that have disabilities. So making sure that we capture those voices, because I see that that's just it's a critical area, and all the data points to that. And I think if we're looking at a lever for change, that's a great place to go.
Okay.
I was going to start talking about the ways of working. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
So pivot all of us.
Great. It is. So ways of working, and maybe this is a bit moving just forward the work that for us over the next year. I had kind of four points. One is around metrics and data. I think right now we've been very focused on a single metric, which is suspensions. And that has a few nuances, but that's the primary data that our teams are focused on. I would just love to re-engage with that question of metrics and data at some point, and hopefully have some more proactive kind of relational metrics that we can, less so from a measurement perspective, to be honest, and more so from a telling our staff what matters, because we are going to be measuring it and driving the behavior in our kind of teams to know that that's something to focus on. So that would be one, just around metrics. You look like you want to say something.
Well, only because you'd be happy that I'm going to reinforce you, and I'm going to give you
Great.
some data here, right? Isn't that nice, right? Okay. That we have been collecting and analyzing data in Cleveland for about now 9 years. And one of the things we've been looking at recently is the relationship between student reports of how they experience conditions for learning, emotional and physical safety, the feeling of support and connectedness, and academic challenge, as well as their perception of peer social and emotional competence, and suspensions in schools. And you'd be happy to know that in those schools where when you see a change that's increasing in positive reports of conditions for learning, those are the places where you're also seeing a reduction in suspensions. Now that still has to be unpacked because lots of things are going on there.
Yep.
But there is a relationship, and certainly if you wanted multiple measures, given what I've heard today, you'd want something like how our students experience the school in addition to issues like suspension, which I think are important.
Yep. Okay, so fantastic, thank you. So the second was around resource alignment. I think we've kind of talked about that, but so I don't need to kind of get into that. The third was around experimentation. This idea was really prevalent in the report around kind of, what was the word used? Learning from variation, right? So I think I am really excited about the opportunity to do some more experimentation. I think it's something that we see a lot. I mean, you mentioned the private sector earlier. The private sector would not be investing incremental resources to do the same thing we've already done that didn't work. So let's kind of devolve some of that and provide some resources for our schools to experiment and fail fast, right, and learn from that, which comes back to defining the metrics up front so we know if it works or doesn't work. And then the last, maybe, Anna, to your point, just on who is involved, I would love to see some of our teachers and some of our students actively involved in this conversation. I think our students, at the end of the year, there was a student rally at West around wanting more teachers of color, right? And that this was a driver of relationships and comfort and feeling secure and safe and welcome and worthy in schools. So I just think there's a voice there that we should actively seek as we move forward in this dialogue, both from our staff as well as student perspectives.
Okay, Nikki, did you?
No, she
Okay,
got a
TJ, before
things
TJ
picking up,
speak,
yeah.
we're about heading into about an hour over planned time. So as you all know, what that means for me is that we're probably down to our last comments, and we're ready to wrap things up. So TJ, you're on deck.
Just reinforcing and building a little bit on two things Kate mentioned in terms of ways of working. First is that, developing metrics that do communicate to our staff what's important to us. Metrics around successful interventions. Maybe the metrics are students who have, 3 behavior incidents and not 10, right? I mean, something like that, where we're measuring successful interventions, not just simply reporting suspensions, reporting behavior incidents, but I think that's very important to us. On the experimentation, whether call it fail safe to fail, probing, whatever you want to call it, one of the things that I think is important, and from reading the Snowden article, et cetera, is that process be opened up, and you mentioned students and teachers, but also be opened up in a way. Snowden emphasizes the need to have spaces for dissent, and that happens, and democratizing it in those ways. And I think that with the behavior education plan, that we have a community guiding coalition, but this body hasn't heard directly from them. We have a joint committee on safety, but since the first year, this body hasn't heard directly from them. And that first year, there was dissent from there, and it was, in my sense, silenced, and I think that our implementation has suffered because of that. So I just want to point out that if we are going to, take the evaluation recommendations around the ways of working, that dissent is a very important, crucial element of it.
Yeah, there's been a lot of good information here during this meeting, and we're talking now about ways of working. But and we talked about a lot of the collaborative work we need to be doing in a lot of different areas. But one of the things I think is important, and I think it's really at the opposite of all of that, is I go back to the elephant in the room. If there's one thing that we need to focus on that can really push us forward, is there one thing that we really need to put in the front of in our windshield? Is it relationship building? And how do we really get there? Is that really the one thing we really should be focusing on? Is there an elephant in the room that's really been preventing us from making those leaps forward that we need to make? And if so, what can we do to really identify that? Again, the relationship building and the area of race that we tend to always shy away from and never want to talk about. Does that really impact how we do our work from the classroom to all levels of the system? We talk about everything around this table and in our offices and what have you, but the conversations around race and how it impacts everything we do is something we just rarely, if ever, touch on. And so, I'm sort of at the other extreme. Is there one or two things we really need to be focusing on and really pound away at that maybe could really push us forward? So that's, for me, my comment on ways of working.
I want to thank you and the board for your time tonight. This was an incredibly informative conversation for our team. I think for at least the senior team, and I think the large leadership team of MMSD who we're meeting with this week, all of our school-based leadership team members, I think we are convinced that the issue of relationship, authentic, trusting relationship with students of color is the main issue. And we want to be able to commit to opening up the discussion about race, and not from an accusatory standpoint, but of one of commitment to being allies to our students, right? Sticking with them, bringing them into the circle of care no matter what, which takes internal work and a commitment to doing it. Like I said, lifelong, right? If you're choosing this profession, you're choosing to do this work. And it takes building some skill that we all need to build together. So we're excited. We will be taking your feedback from tonight and making sure that you have in your hands, we hope by the end of this month, as we gear up for the next school year, our best thinking for the implementation plan. On our way forward, mainly just zeroing in on precisely the focus areas, given your input tonight. And then, of course, that will feed into some reports throughout the year, and then our big policy discussion in May, which will also lead to a resource discussion, I think, given tonight's discussion. But we're really looking forward to making an impact in the next few years. Can we give David a round of applause? Final word?
To all of you as well, okay?
Always a pleasure, Dr. Osher. It's always informative. Any final comments that you would like to make at this time?
I think if any place has the ability to do it, in the end, you guys do. And everything from size to the type of commitment I see. I think raising the elephant is hugely important. And I think the only thing I would add is to my full agreement about relationship and culturally responsive relationship is that it's relationships and culturally responsible connections, relationships within the context of learning and the high stakes of development.
Yes.
It's all those
the
things
change
together.
process.
So this is not, to go back, it's not soft.
No.
Right?
Oh, man.
This is about the fact that learning is about relationship, and learning leverages relationship, so you have to have it.
Thank you.
Okay, one comment?
It's nice.
Please.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
thank you for being here, and I also wanted to thank Andrew. I mean, this is the first report I think I've seen coming out of your team, and I just want it was fantastic. I think compared to the last evaluation we saw, I would take your work any day. So yeah,
Yeah.
no, I mean, just
Yeah.
you've heard a lot of us
Yeah.
comment on
Yeah.
insights we drew from it. So thank you for your.
You should know I was about to tell him what a good job he did, so now I'm saying in public.
All right. I move adjournment.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposition? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for correcting me, I forgot about that, I apologize.